Hello and welcome to Think Like a Game Designer. I'm your host, Justin Gary. In this podcast, I'll be having conversations with brilliant game designers from across the industry with a goal of finding universal principles that anyone can apply in their creative life. You could find episodes and more at thinklikeagamedesigner.com. In today's episode, I speak with Cole Wehrle. Cole is the creative director at Leader Games and one of the leads on Root, Oath, and a variety of other games that really push the boundaries of narrative storytelling and game design that is honestly too difficult for most people to pull off. He identifies the sweet spot of Leader Games as games that are too expensive and challenging for small companies and too risky for large companies, creating this really ideal zone. And we dive deep into a lot of the nuances of design. We talk about Cole's origin story and how his historical knowledge and building these weird historical games that sold 500 copies got him started. We talk about how his skill sets of learning how to make yourself useful turned into a deep understanding of graphic design, and we talk for a while around how visuals and artistic design informs game design and vice versa. We talk a lot about Root, is probably his most popular game. We talk about the interesting design complexities that come from asymmetric starting positions, meaning different players have very different play patterns and very different abilities at the start of the game. We talk about Oath and legacy gameplay and the upsides and downsides of having games that survive traits from one game to another and the different ways to do that. We talk about the process of launching games and how the business of games influences the types of games you can make, and the idea of crowdfunding and the idea of how different future designs and future progression of the industry might influence you as a new designer or a new publisher. There's a ton of great content in here. We get really into the weeds. So if you are really enjoying the kind of deep dive into the nitty gritty of game design, Cole's mind is wonderful. We originally had a deep conversation over dinner at GDC, and we continued it here, and I'm sure we're going to continue it again next time we see each other. But I was really grateful to get to share his insights with you, my audience. And so without any further ado, here is Cole Wehrle. Hello and welcome. I am here with Cole Wehrle. Cole, man, it's great to get to chat with you.
Good to see you, Justin.
Yeah, so we kind of met and had a great little dinner at GDC a couple months ago, and was instantly intrigued. And I'm pretty sure I asked you right away if you wanted to be on the podcast because I had many questions for you that I wasn't able to finish getting discussed at dinner. So thanks for making the time.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
So I know I've got a definitely at least a short hit list of stuff I know I want to get to. And you're one of the people who has experience on the, all the different sides of the equation as a designer and a developer and a publisher. And so I'm sure we'll touch on all of those things. But let's, I always do like to start with an origin story here. So what kind of got you into the gaming industry? I think I read you had like a PhD in English, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And so walk me through PhD to game designer or anything that's before that of note.
it's a funny thing. I mean, I think one thing about this industry that is mostly charming is that no one studies to be in the tabletop industry. You stumble into it. And I certainly felt like I stumbled into it. I was very happy. I think a lot of people get through graduate school and they come out with a lot of baggage and trauma. I actually had a very nice time. It was hard. It was stressful. But I thought I was going to be teaching Victorian literature my entire life. At some point, though, I started designing games as fan products. I've played games kind of all my life. I've been really interested in different communities around play. I used to play a lot of competitive StarCraft and very different sorts of games. And I grew up in a family where we played a lot of sports and a lot of board games. And so games and making up games was always just kind of a part of who I was. And then when I was in graduate school, I stumbled into this very strange corner of historical gaming where basically people had started kind of like right before Kickstarter, they had started running these like little pop-up game companies where it was pretty easy to publish a game. So I published my first design through this company called Sierra Madre Games. And they had a very simple business model that mostly relied on its founder printing some games, having them shipped to him before Essen. He'd send some out as pre-orders, and then he'd print 500 copies. I mean, it's sort of like if you've ever played the old game Coup. That game was also run by a kind of similar company where it's like, look, I want to print 500 copies. Maybe a bigger publisher will pick it up, and then I'm going to move to the next project. And I was so taken with this way of doing work because it allowed people to publish games that were almost non-commercial. You could design a game about sort of any subject you wanted. And I remember I was playing this game called Pax Porfiriana about the Mexican Revolution, and in the back of the rule book of Pax Porfiriana, there was this funny little note that said, like, "Hey, if you have an idea for a historical game, you should send it to us because we'll look at it." And there was, an AOL email address or something on it, and I wrote the founder of the company a message and started chatting with him. And in those early days, I mean, I did what the same thing I tell a lot of younger designers and developers to do, which is I just try to make myself useful. I found a publisher I liked, and then I did they need someone to do graphic design? Okay, I'll teach myself graphic design. They need someone to work a convention. All right, I'm going to go to the convention. And as I did, the longer I did that, you start picking up skills, and then pretty soon I was finding myself getting more traction with those weird historical games than with my PhD research.
What do you mean by traction?
Well, they were selling out. Which I never. That's always like a funny brag, and it's not meant as a brag. They were selling so few copies that it was easy for them to sell out, is what was happening. So they're doing a run of a few thousand copies to an extremely dedicated audience. They sell within a calendar year, and then the publisher says, "Hey, if you have another one, we'd be happy to publish it." So they were kind of like pre-signing me for the next game even before it had even been conceived.
And your just orient me a little bit. Around what year is this happening?
So this is around like 2014. I started
Okay.
working. So the first title I worked on properly was called Greenland, and I think it came out in 2013.
And when you said learn graphic design, so I learned graphic design. I just didn't want to gloss that over. That's a pretty big step there. What happened there?
Yeah, so I was working. I had a funny university appointment where I had to manage all these essentially computer labs, and as part of that, they give you a computer with a bunch of software on it. And so I had access to the Adobe suite, and it was a pretty boring job because a projector would break. You'd go and help fix the projector for a class, and so you're kind of serving as essentially tech support for other teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And during my downtime, I just started learning how Illustrator and InDesign worked, and then eventually that led me to actually find some textbooks on principles of graphic design. And the very first products I started working on were fan redraws of board games, which I liked, but I found were either ugly or not functional. So I was sort of using them as well, I want to teach myself visual hierarchy. So can I lay out a magic card better than a magic card is laid out? Answer no. Later, there are certain
Spoiler alert. No.
yeah, spoiler alert. Well, some systems are very proven. And instead, what would happen is I went and I found games that were published in the '90s and were very very scrappy, and I just kind of gave them a little bit of a facelift. And it was such a good way to learn the fundamentals of visual design, which actually informs even how I do game design. I really do the visual design at the same time as I'm doing the game design.
Okay, great. So there are so many principles here, and I'm just tag a few of them, and then I want to dig into this idea of visual hierarchies and graphic design informing game design.
Yeah.
But the phrase you used of just make yourself useful, right? Go do the things and find ways to add value to the community you care about, a publisher you like. Common refrain from amongst all the successful designers here, and something I recommend also very strongly to anybody that is looking to get into the space. This willingness to kind of learn a variety of different skill sets that are to kind of move down that path and make yourself more valuable, incredibly useful. And this really interesting little subset, which probably requires more conversation, and maybe we'll come back to, is this idea of the ability to produce at small scale and be able to get things out there and serve a small audience and just test different things. Right? You were doing your PhD work, you were doing some couple little games, and the fact that you could test and get traction and find, hey, people actually want this thing and people want more of this, and I can move down that road, lets you kind of continue to invest further. And I think those are all pretty tried and true principles of how to succeed in whatever industry you want to succeed in. And so I think those are all worthwhile things. Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that last point
course.
about finding a community? Because it's one of the things that I'm most alarmed by when I talk to people who are just starting out, where they have this very fully formed idea for a game, but kind of don't have an audience. Like they don't know who they're even speaking to. And they then will spend like months, even years sometimes, like cooking in their own sauces. And it was so nice to be like, okay, well, I know precisely the publisher. I know what kinds of games that they like, that their audience likes. And so I want to pitch them a game that already seems like something that they should publish. And you kind
Yeah.
of get to start on third base as opposed to, being at bat.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Like and what I hear is kind of two sides to that, right? One is like, pitching to the, like, been building to the audience that you want to serve very specifically, right? And knowing that. And two is like, don't stew in your own sauces for too long, right? Make sure that your whatever you're making gets tested against reality as soon as possible, right? Like, don't just kind of the one of the most corrosive myths in all of creativity is this idea of like the lone genius that like goes off into a cave for like months or years or whatever, and then comes out with a fully formed, beautiful, perfect thing. Like that is the exact opposite of the way that this works. And so, yeah, I want to kill that idea dead. So, yeah,
Yes.
thanks for double emphasizing that. All right, I want to dig into the idea of graphic design informing game design and vice versa. Loved your concept of just taking old games and improving the visuals as a way to kind of learn and understand. I think one, I'd like you to define a little bit the idea of a visual hierarchy, because I think a lot of people won't necessarily know. It's somewhat implied in the phrasing, but I think a lot of people won't know what we're talking about. And then let's talk about how your understanding of visual and graphic design informs game design and vice versa.
Sure. So when I started doing graphic design, the very first thing I did was I had learned to draw earlier in my life, and one of the exercises that you do once you get the principles is you go to a museum and you sit there and you try to draw what you're looking at, and it just makes you appreciate these like unwritten rules of composition um, and I mean all the rules that we use to arrange and describe art. Um, they're useful and you can kind of intuit them yourself, but actually there's no better way to do it than to try to copy something that's already been done. I kind of applied that to thinking about games where I thought, oh well, this is a deck of cards. Could I design a deck of cards? And in that process you're starting to learn about like red versus black cards, suits, what separates a face card, how often are you printing those numbers, do you even need to print the numbers? And you're having to like see how it took hundreds of years for these visual objects to evolve. And so one piece of advice I usually give people when they're learning graphic design is that there is software to learn for sure, but the software is actually secondary to the theory. And if you pick up any book of graphic design, you're going to encounter like chapter one, visual hierarchy. It's the most important and central character of graphic design. And all it describes is the implied priority of pieces of information in a visual space. Or to put very bluntly, what thing do you see first when you look at something?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and I think this idea of a visual priority is critical, right? Where does my eye get drawn, right? And then choosing as a designer, consciously saying, okay, I want you to have this information. This is the most important thing. So, say the casting cost of a card, right,
Yeah.
or where that location is. So maybe I'm going to put attack and defense and all the combat stats in one specific zone, so that when I decide, okay, we're involved in combat, I'm going to look in a certain area and I'll have all the information I need. Or while a card's in my hand, all the information I need is going to be in a different zone. And so thinking about those kinds of things in terms of how you prioritize. And I think this, one of the common mistakes, and as I'm saying this, it's kind of, I think, across the board, right? One of the common mistakes is people they want to prioritize everything and thus prioritize nothing, right? And
Right.
and this is true in game design. I've seen as well, where it's like, oh, I'm trying to make a game that's for everybody. You're like, no, you're not. You're going to make a game that's for nobody if you do that.
Because the costs are expressed so beautifully. I mean, it's almost like a visual proof or something. Because if you want to make something, if you want to give something graphical hierarchy, often the first step is make it big. But when you're making things big, that's taking area away from other parts of the card. So you
Hmm.
you have to so well, you'll encounter this thing. I encounter this all the time actually when I run into folks, and they're like, "Well, I want to make these tarot cards because they're larger and they'll be able to hold all the information." And I'm like, "Don't do that because tarot cards are so hard to shuffle. They're
Yeah.
expensive to produce, and you're just excusing yourself from having to make the harder decision about what's actually important on that card."
Yeah, that's right. And in defense of tarot cards, I did make a game with tarot cards called Ringmaster from back in the day, but it was exactly designed as it was an aesthetic choice, not a
Yes.
information. In fact, those cards have some of the least information of any cards I made. There was no cost, no numbers at all. It was just a short text box, and I was making tarot cards because it was a kind of circus themed game, and I wanted to evoke like the tarot
Right.
card readers and those things, right? So it's a, and I'm saying that in part to agree with you because I think the what you're doing, every decision you make has a trade off, and so that one purposefully, it's a deck that you don't shuffle very often. It's a 30 card, kind of simple thing where you're just drawing occasionally, and so there were trade offs for making a game that had tarot cards and what that sizing was. So every single decision you make has these, costs associated with it that I think
Right.
most people aren't as conscious of, and I think it's really valuable to bring to the surface and show how kind of designers think about this sort of thing.
Well, and it's a place where I think starting small and working on some small scale projects from beginning to end, where I'm really touching every part of the project, was really important in my creative practice because any graphic designer knows about these costs. And if you teach yourself a little bit of graphic design, you can kind of start to see how a graphic designer is going to sort through this problem when it goes on their desk. I feel the same way about rules editing. Like I try really hard to write my own rule books and to do a lot of like the higher order editorial tasks. And it's because if I can't put a rule into a sentence cleanly, then it's true that an editor can probably solve that problem for me, but there's probably something more fundamentally wrong with the rule. And I feel
Hmm.
the same way about like a card layout. Like if I'm struggling with a particular card layout, the visual grammar of the game is running into a problem, and that's probably a design level issue that could be solved. It could be kind of like ham-fistedly solved by a really skilled graphic designer. I mean, that's like board games are in this really remarkable place right now where the graphic design has improved so much. You have these professional graphic designers who are amazing. I mean, I think about Ian O'Toole's work, who's an unbelievable graphic designer and who can build a visual syntax to describe any currency conversion in any Euro game.
Hmm.
But what happens then is he is so fluent in his visual language that I think it's making it easier for designers to not do the hard work of development and actually simplify things when they need to be simplified.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing where the skill of one part of the process can allow for a lack of skill or a cover over some errors in another part of the process. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. I think that there's a lot of uh, other things that come to mind when I think about this design of a specifically a card in a game like this, right? Like how much information you're putting out there. I used to work at Upper Deck back in the day when they were publishing Yu-Gi-Oh in the U.S. and those cards, like the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh are actually pretty simple, like the baseline rules, but the cards would have this like block of text with all of these little exceptions and custom things. And then when you have different games where there's 10 stats on a card, it just becomes very difficult to plot, to process and play. And so the question of like who your audience is and what their tolerance is for those things matters a lot. And then the
Right.
medium matters a lot, right? If it's on a card, if it's based on a board, if it's in an app, if it's in a there's all these different areas of like what types of information can be processed, which dictate what type of game you're able to build. I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to jump forward because I think what probably the game. I mean, the game you're probably most well known for is Root, and the that game is actually pretty complicated for
Yeah.
the wide audience that it has reached, and I think part of that is the visual design. Right, it's a very friendly, very welcoming visual design, and I'm curious how you got to that place with that
Mhm.
scale of mechanics and complexity, and I guess just understanding the design and kind of we could bounce around a few different topics here, but I'm interested in that marriage of aesthetic and design.
So Root was a very funny design because Patrick had hired me as a developer and had offered me this prompt that basically said, "We made Vast the Crystal Caverns, which is a asymmetric dungeon crawler. Could we apply that style of game to a strategy game?" And that means dramatically asymmetric factions. And I had a lot of thoughts about this, and many of them are kind of like housed in Root. So Root was basically trying to answer this premise. But The reason I like to start by mentioning what Patrick gave me is Patrick gave me both a design sheet, it was kind of like a half page. Here's what I would love the design to be able to do someday. And then he also offered me kind of a house style because Vast the Crystal Caverns had come out, it had found an audience, and it kind of established the level of complexity that I knew that I was going to be able to deal with, which is to say a 3,000 word rule book, maybe like a proprietary 500 to 1,000 words for each faction, in addition to kind of sitting on top of that, kind of in the medium to heavyweight category and as a hobby game. So I'm not making Twilight Imperium here, but I'm also not making Catan. Uh, when we were working on the game, one thing we found out about it was that the design was exceptionally mean. It was just a very kind of mean spirited game. And as we were talking about the design, we didn't want to necessarily make it nicer because when Root was at its best was when players were playing like at their scrappily. It was kind of an old fashioned design in that way. We wanted to find a way for players to be kind of okay with the fact that they were going to be playing this old fashioned design. And Kyle had done some illustrations for these animals for a different project, and we had kind of, I can't remember even who first suggested it, was either myself or Kyle, I think, that the animals could actually be very well suited to the game, and we found that this very puzzling output. So usually, when you do a game with modern sensibilities, you you take away these things that get called like feel bad moments, which I hate that phrase for a ton of reasons. I think it's as a design principle, it can be useful for a lot of designers. It's like not useful for me. So when
Hmm.
you take away these things, if you want to make a game about war without feel bad moments, you need to convince the players it's still about war. So you use this very like brawny, blood soaked art to kind of get them in the spirit of the game, even though the game itself is like a drafting game. My favorite example is Eric Lang's Blood Rage, which has this
Hmm.
great Adrian Smith art. These Vikings are just cracking each other's skulls. But the game is closer to Sushi Go than it
Hmm.
is to like any war game. And with Root, we actually found this weird opposite thing, which is that the art is so whimsical and charming that it allows the game to be even meaner than a regular war game because it is couching it all in like the aesthetics of like a cartoon or a piece of children's lit. Um, and that like led to this very odd product. So when we kind of had the whole thing assembled, we talked about it as a team, and we looked at it and said, boy, there are a lot of people who are going to buy this and not know what they're buying. And they're going to sit down to play it with their family. And they're going to be horrified to discover that they've like accidentally bought a war game. And the argument that I offered the team then, and that I still believe in now, is that the vast majority of games and play that exists in this world is confrontational and pretty aggressive. And that is actually a very well suited to play. Like if you have ever played, a game of spades with your grandparents, they will ruin you. They will crack your
Hmm.
skull. And so we, as a hobby, we're leaving a lot on the table if designers are moving away from those styles of games. So we kind of made a bet that people actually do want these types of games. They just don't usually like the aesthetics that are associated with them, and that's kind of
Hmm.
the foundational bet that Root has made. Um,
I love that, and yeah, it ties right back into the sort of visual design informing the game design and vice versa. So let's double click on the feel bad moments,
sure.
and how feel bad moments make you feel bad or don't make you feel bad. Um, and is
Yeah.
this because one of my phrases is that your job as a designer is to frustrate your players, right? Like you're trying to create positive tension, and
Yeah.
it's the resolution of that tension that is part of the fun of like traditional games, in particular, most games broadly. Is it a similar concept that you're describing, or is there something else
Yes.
to it here? Yeah.
Well, it's a very similar concept, and I think I So I think frustration is incredibly important because I think that the games that are the most compelling for my own sake are the ones that are kind of like right on the edge of your cognition. You like can't quite figure out. It's this paradox, and it's something that I kind of ran into when I got into competitive play. When I really started playing a lot of StarCraft, for instance, there was an older friend taught me how to play, and I had a lot of interest in doing laddering and playing in local tournaments and things. And he said, and I said, I really want to learn this. He said, how much do you like losing? He said, because you're really only going to enjoy this whole process if you love losing. And I was like, well, I don't want to lose. I want to win. He's like, no, you don't understand. Losing means that you're learning. When you lose a game, the game is offering you all these lessons. And when you win a game, you kind of don't learn anything. You learn like a little bit, but it's so clouded by your own like biases that you're not really going to pull any like meaningful lesson out of that win. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that framing is really important, and it kind of ties into how I think about design too, because I think you want to be offering players a challenge, a puzzle, a moment of frustration, and then the resolution of that frustration, of course, is going to be tremendously satisfying. But I generally, when I talk to my devs here at Leader Games or working on a project, I usually tell people, don't be obsessed with a player's feelings in a moment. Don't like look for fun, because if you overemphasize positive feedback when you're doing design, you're going to do like it's going to steer you into this like mushy world of design where the game kind of like loses all of its tension, it loses its ability to say anything. I have a friend, Tim Fowers, who's a wonderful game designer, and he told me I was on a panel with him or something, and someone asked him, "Do you ever do A/B testing on your games?" And he's like, "The problem with A/B testing is that if you're making art and you're doing A/B testing, you're either going to end up with gambling or pornography at the end of the road."
Hmm. Hmm.
And it was just he was like, the game has to be guided by like a higher order of aesthetic sensibility. And I think I love the idea of like positioning it around frustration, right? So I mean, I'll give it a specific example in Root. Um, and this is true of a lot of asymmetric games. So oftentimes asymmetric games have to confront problems of balance. It's the number one thing that people ask about. Everyone's obsessed with balance. If
Mm-hmm.
you run into a faction that is too powerful in Root, usually the first impulse is to weaken the faction or to strengthen all the factions around it. But there's another approach, which is you look at the faction and you say, playing an overpowered faction is in fact not good, but boring. And what you need to do is find ways of introducing strategic liabilities that can create that tension to actually make it interesting. Because oftentimes there's nothing worse than using an overpowered character to just like, curb stop a bunch of noobs just over and over and over again. I mean, it can be fun for a Saturday afternoon, but as a strategic experience, it's like eating cotton candy for dinner. Like there's no longer term engagement with the game if that's how you're playing.
Interesting. I think there are several players that would disagree with that experience and the characterization of that experience. But I mean, I agree with you. But people like to win, and then, but I'll say there's a couple things here. One, for anybody that's interested, Tim Fowers, also, yeah, great. He's one of our first guests on the podcast from many years ago. So you can look at one of our top first 10 episodes. I think he was on the podcast. Has a lot of great insights and comes at things from a perspective I really appreciate. Two, I think that the this idea I got all right, let's just dig into it, because this idea of asymmetric starting games was one of the meatier topics I wanted to spend time on. So since
Sure,
we're
sure, sure.
here, let's like asymmetric start. I have a real love-hate relationship with asymmetric starting position games. I think I have somewhat to a fault battled against them in my own designs because of my competitive nature. I find that it is nearly impossible to balance them correctly, right? I mean, and there's two sides to it. One is like, is it possible to balance correctly in fact, and is it possible to balance correctly in player perception? And they're both
Yeah.
problems that are almost impossible to do correctly, because the different player skill levels, and there's a million different aspects to it. So what I heard you say is that strategic liabilities could make it interesting, even if you're not even trying to make them even. But
Mhm.
I would love to dig in further. And how do you think
Yeah.
about those aspects?
Well, I mean, I actually, Justin, I agree with you. Like, I generally do not like working on asymmetric games. It's only expensive. Like if I'm pitching a game to a studio and I say, oh, there are 10 asymmetric factions. If that studio head knows is worth their salt, they know that basically I'm saying this movie's budget has a floor of $100 million. I mean, it's just
Hmm.
expensive. It's going to require
Right.
tons of work, and it's an expense that is felt. And this is a really like in the weeds comment, but I want to say it. The asymmetry is expensive in every way a game can be expensive. It is It is unique layouts at the level of graphics. It's unique rules at an editorial level. It's unique sculpts if you're doing different miniatures. I mean, it is hitting you every way a game can hit you if you make an asymmetric game. So like, why on earth would anyone do it? And to me, there is a reason to do it, which is when you're engaging with asymmetry, you are allowing players access to different kinds of immersion. So, which I think is important because I think there's like a different argument for why asymmetry might be useful or not useful in a competitive framework. If we're just talking about competitive games, and here I could rhapsodize about StarCraft for a long time and how the asymmetry
Hmm.
both works and doesn't work. But in the context of board games, if you're trying to tell stories and you tailor a specific faction to be sensitive to this like very complicated starting situation, that is going to put that player in the world that you're building in a much deeper way than a symmetrical start. Now, there's a downfall to this, which is as our positions of asymmetry drift apart, we stop playing the same game. Right.
Correct.
So like, if I'm the Terran and you're the Zerg, like we're both fighting over the planet, we still have a lot in common. But if I'm playing like a medic and you're playing like a bombardier pilot, why are we even in the same game? And so there's this kind
Right.
of like, I think asymmetry offers immersion like with limits, and that's a very important, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and so there's like tons of different sides to this, right? So there's like digital games like StarCraft and team fight tactics and a variety of other ones where you come in with a different character, or even RPGs and World of Warcraft, stuff like that. You come with a different faction and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And I think those in some sense succeed because like balance is constantly adjusted. Like every one of those
Constantly,
games
yes.
is constantly tweaking. And so it's constantly upshifting and moving. And so the variety of that, I think, helps solve many of the problems in a sense, because it's just like,
Yeah.
okay, if there's a problem, you fix it. If there's a problem, you fix it. Right? Tabletop games don't really have that luxury. So that's one side of like asymmetry that like I think only really works because of the constant introduction and updating. And then there's the versions of asymmetry, which I guess from a tabletop perspective, the closest thing would be like trading card games and games where it's like, okay, again, those ones we have a symmetrical like theoretical starting position, and then we choose and we opt into the
Yes.
asymmetry in play, and then ideally there is balance because the variety of strategies can counteract and change over time. Then there's a version of this that is the more like boxed tabletop complete version, and that one, what you've done with Root pushes it way further than for a strategy game I've encountered in a game that does it so successfully. I would argue it really does feel like you're playing completely different games with these different
Yep.
factions and Root. And so it's such a like I've done this in a variety of ways in a couple of my games. We did it with Ascension. We did an expansion called Dawn of Champions, where every player gets a kind of starting character that they can play with. And if I'm being honest, it's my least favorite Ascension set to play with, because I feel, and this is the other challenge I wanted to kind of put on you,
Yeah.
I feel somewhat railroaded, right?
Yes.
This character rewards me for doing thing X. That means if I do anything but X, I feel like I'm playing at a disadvantage.
Yep.
And so I feel like I have less strategic variety. And so I try to address that. And just before I'll finish monologuing shortly, but
Mhm.
I think it's really interesting, and I've wrestled with this a lot, so I want to give more context. With Shards of Infinity, you all have your own character personas, and when I first launched the game, it had no differentiation between them, again because I wanted this to, I didn't believe in asymmetry. And then I added asymmetry, but it was a asymmetry you built into it. It was called Relics of the Future, and after a certain period of time you earned enough experience, you could unlock one of two unique to you cards that could dictate your strategy going forward. But because I gave you a modal path, because it didn't start the game that way, it felt like it didn't have that railroading problem. But the idea of starting from the beginning of a thing with a completely different set of like resources and goals feels like it's very hard to create interesting strategic variety. So
Right.
rant
So,
over. I'll pass it
no,
back.
no, no. Well, that was very well put because it does to me. Okay, so we're getting this level of immersion that we get with asymmetry. Let's assume that's just like a given. We can say, okay, asymmetry and these, especially like a curated setup, it's giving you a sense of like the things you're worried about. I've been playing these. I played a game called Here I Stand recently, and which is about the Martin Luther and the Reformation. It's a big historical game. It takes 10 hours. But if you're playing England, you're Henry VIII. What are you trying to do? You're trying to have a male heir. and
Hmm.
that's your whole game. And then, if you're playing the Sultans, if you're playing the Ottomans, you're trying to take Vienna. And what's fascinating about the game is how it feels like I'm in a play, like I've got a role. There's like a thing that I'm trying to do, and my role feels very deep. I feel like very interested in the character I'm playing. But am I really playing a game? Like, not really. I feel like I'm like acting. Uh, I think one of the key points about Root's success is that the asymmetric roles in Root do not railroad players. They say, to me, well, not actually, one of my least favorite examples of asymmetry in modern games is something like Twilight Imperium, where you get dealt a race that has a very specific benefit, and that really does just dictate what you're doing. And to a degree that sometimes when I'm playing TI, I'm not even really thinking about the decisions I'm making. Like, oh, I get +1 on cruisers, so I'm only going to be building cruisers. Like
Hmm.
that's what because I know, like, my little game designer brain turns on and I'm like, if this is my competitive advantage, I will get the most out of this if I push it as hard as I can possibly push it. So Root gets out of that problem because it says you have so little in common with the other players that you can't even lean into your differences because there are only differences. So it's not as if
Mm.
like whoever plays their role the best, quote unquote, is going to necessarily win. But then there are two things that Root does. So the first thing that Root does is it says every faction actually has about 3 different strategic paths. And oftentimes the best approach is a mixed strategy. And I think that this is like, it's getting to kind of more traditional game theory about saddle points and things like that. But you often want games that offer a mixed strategy where it's like, look, the optimal strategy is not always throw rock or always throw scissors, but it's to throw rock like 20% of the time or whatever that might be. So, Root kind of says every faction's got these different approaches that you were able to kind of tactically and strategically swing into as you play the game. And the second thing that I think Root does really well is that the nature of the game changes dramatically, capital D dramatically, depending on which factions are in play. And so the faction mix and Root, which can be assembled using a little, like, there's a competitive draft that people play with that is officially sanctioned, and it's in the Marauder expansion. Um, that draft sets the nature of the game that we're about to play, and then that kind of setup puts pressure on your strategic approaches. And the light bulb that usually turns on, and this to me is the reason why Root has done so well for so long, because I can tell you the first 100,000 copies of Root were sold because the box art is gorgeous and adorable. But we've now gotten to a point where there are annual tournaments in many different countries. People are playing the game, and I know it's more than the art that's animating it. And I think the thing that's animating it is when you select a set of Root factions, it dramatically alters the nature of the game. And usually the first time this happens with players, or when they own enough factions that they can play a game without the cats. And so suddenly the board is a lot emptier, and the game has just a very different character. And as people start playing it, they realize that all of their strategies, their calculuses, their kind of strategic heuristics have to adjust to this new like moment they're in. And it's the equivalent of like playing with a new set of magic cards or something, where you're like, wow, this strategic paradigm was so important last season. It doesn't work in this mix. And now I'm kind of flying on the seat of my pants.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Again, a lot to unpack there, right? This idea that there's an initial hook that brings people into the game, and the cute art and kind of style and is a thing. But the thing that's going to keep people over the long term, the thing that's going to sell your 100,000 to million plus copies is going to be because the game has a level of like interest and strategic depth and joy that is not exhaustible, right? And
Yeah,
that this variety of starting positions can allow that. That's why, I mean, frankly, any game that does expansions to some extent is trying to pull off this same
yeah,
magic trick. And I think the asymmetric starting positions does support that somewhat intrinsically, though it I would guess, and again, I've not played enough Root with enough of the different factions to know this, but I would guess it is again it's got to be just impossible to actually balance those scenarios correctly. But there's so
sure.
many of them that you just won't know. If a game's
Yeah,
not balanced, but I've only played it twice, it's like who knows? It's fine,
well,
right? If that configuration, I mean, yeah.
there's a funny sidebar here about like how do we even assess balance. One of the most one of the most important things that happened to me as a young designer when I was starting off like in 2011, 2012, just thinking about it, is I was reading David Sirlin's design blog, which was this fascinating window into like how people were talking about design in like circa 2011. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but he had this amazing post about tiering of Street Fighter 2 characters,
Mm-hmm.
and he said like, okay, look, we've got some of these characters are clearly like S tier, and some are A tier, and some are B tier, and he had numbers to back it up. He said like, look, in these matchups, these characters are winning by this amount. We can use this to derive a tiering list, and he had, I mean, kind of S through D tier characters. And he said, look, and Street Fighter is a very well balanced game. And I was like, how could it be well balanced if this character pick has like a 20% win rate against this other character? Isn't that not balance? And his argument was that like when we're talking about balance, we're always talking about a range of acceptable outputs, right? Because you don't like if the game is spitting completely even outputs, you should be like suspicious of that number. Like it was probably a little cooked. And
Nor is
then
it likely to be fun in reality.
yeah,
Like
exactly. Well, because it'll just start like what ends up happening is these rules of large numbers start taking over, where it's like, well, if you put enough randomness in the system, then I'll give you a game that like we're going to roll a d6, everyone gets a number, we're going to roll that die. It's a beautifully balanced game.
perfectly balanced. Congratulations.
Yeah, you've got it.
Yeah.
Um, but it is one of those things that like root is an impossible to balance game. So the way that we do root balancing on the back end is we have sort of like flags for the different factions. Like, oh, this faction like doesn't have a lot of pieces on the board. And then we have other factions that like benefit from games where there are a few pieces on the board. And so we'll run these matchups that are like curated where it's like, okay, this should be a degenerate matchup because we have one very aggressive faction and three peaceful factions. The aggressive faction should just be winning. And then we will look at those weird scenarios and then balance for them and make sure that their viable strategic paths are still operating. And then we take that adjusted faction and put it in the general pool to make sure we didn't break anything else. But we are basically, I mean, I have a script that I run that it looks at all of the viable root matchups. And then we look at the ones that the script has put on the edge of viability and we test just those matchups. Because if those work, then the other ones are going to work too.
So, what does it mean to say at the edge of viability then?
So every root faction has a number associated with it called its reach. And reach basically means how able is that faction to influence the board state. And this is a soft number. This is a number that I pull out of a hat and I just say like that faction, that's a 6 or whatever. And then every player count has a value where you need to have at least this many kind of reach points in the game in order for the game to be valid. And so if I'm playing with a bunch of low reach factions, it's not a good game because if someone starts winning, the game, like the actual table, cannot change the outcome because everyone is too low reach. In a high player count game, though, you can have more low reach factions because you're kind of splitting the power of the herd across a wider range of people. And so what we do is I just run this little script. It's very simple, and it'll tell me what is on the edge of that viability, and then it will play those games, which might lead to the reach numbers getting boosted a little bit or diminished a little bit.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Okay, yeah, I love that. I love that as a tool, and I think there's this really fascinating world that's like sort of coming where as AI is getting better at playing games, we'll actually be able to run like these
Yeah,
million monkeys, million typewriters scenarios and find these breakpoints. I also think that one of the points you raised earlier is really important. That's like, what does it mean to be balanced, right? This is a common phrase, and we know we don't want even is not doesn't mean even, doesn't mean equal. In fact,
right, right.
that's expressly not the objective because it's actually not fun. And the way I typically will describe balance is that there's sort of no one strategy such that if I knew you were doing that strategy, there's no possible counter to it.
Yes,
Is kind of my benchmark. for how to run this, and so that there are counter strategies and the possibilities of adapting, and because that adaptation process is fun. And then there's like other interesting things in terms of Richard Garfield was on the podcast and talked about his game Spectromancer, which had because it was a digital card game that had asymmetric starting positions, was they had a lot of data on what factions, which factions were better, quote unquote, than others. And what they found was that in the casual player, like if you were not good at the game, certain factions were much more likely to win and certain factions were much more
Right.
likely to lose. And as you got better, those shifted. And so because they were more complicated to play. And so the question was, should you just balance around the top tier players? And the answer is almost certainly no, because most people are not like that, and that's going to ruin people's experiences. So understanding what the game is like for a beginner, and when I'm just coming into this, of which I think something like Root excels a lot because it's so different every time you play a faction. You can't really have any
Right.
clue like until you played all the factions and had a sense of it. So it's like it survives the first several games in a way that I think is
Yeah.
asymmetric games get a bonus for. And then there's this sort of challenge of like, okay, now how do you figure out where it's solved? And I love this idea. Of reach, right? Of the like different mechanics having different capabilities of influencing and impacting others. And I guess I interpret it sort of similarly as just sort of like interactivity, right?
Yeah.
Like if yeah.
But the
uh,
main thing I want to mention about reach is that I think sometimes when we're doing like reviews on our own content as designers, we tend to prioritize like the hard data versus the soft. So I can arrange all the Dominion cards by like cost. And that's useful, but, like, there might be a better number that I could invent that would factor in a bunch of elements to the card, and then I could sort them by that, like, judged value, and so I like talking about reach because it is like a made up concept, and it comes from the
mhm.
idea that if like, what makes a viable table of root? Oh, there has to be, like, a certain, like, interactivity threshold that needs to be reached, and then we can measure all the factions for their interactivity. Like, that is a layer of nonsense on top of the actual hard code of the design, but it allows us to like see and sculpt what the design can do.
Yeah, I think, it is a common novice designer approach that they're just going to find some spreadsheet that's going to output the power level of a given card or faction or ability, and then we'll just use that spreadsheet, and that will determine everything, and I don't need to worry about balancing
Yeah,
after that, right? Like that's just an illusion in and of itself. And so this idea that there has to be some amount of, kind of soft, intuitive assessment that has to be part of this, and then another one of my kind of like my rules for balance is like sort of when in doubt push the fun, right? Like you're
yeah,
never going to get it exactly right, but if like summoning a giant fire breathing dragon turns out to be a little bit overpowered, like so be it, right? But if like a stasis lockdown that lets nobody play any resources or play any abilities at all, it turns out to be the best strategy, well, okay, your game is kind of ruined. So like
yeah.
when in doubt,
The,
make dragons better and make stasis worse.
well, and this is something that we ran into like with base root, where like base root was in some respects like there are parts of that design that are very conservative, especially in the actual card powers. Because I hadn't designed a game with card powers until root really, and my first time getting a deck of cards where I'm like, oh yeah, I could put a power on this card. It can work with any faction. It gives them a special power. I as a younger designer, especially at that time, I didn't really know what the limits of those powers were. And so there are parts of Root that are like very conservative. And then with every single product, we've gotten like a little looser. We've said like, you know
Mm,
what? Let's actually like when we actually built the second deck, which is just an alternate, it basically is an expansion. It's another way of playing the game, replaces all the cards. It is dramatically more interesting and a little less balanced. And like,
mm-hmm,
and so and I think, and a lot of this came. I mean, this is funny. We watched. I think designers always fall into two camps, and I'm in the camp that like actually watches every single review of
mm,
every game I work on because I want when I see a reviewer talk about a game, I see them not as a reviewer but as like another player. And if their especially if their sensibility is like mine, and they don't like something I worked on, then I'm like, okay, well, I went astray somewhere because they should like the game as much as I do. And I remember watching the Shut Up and Sit Down review of Root, which I thought they were going to love, and instead they had these very mixed feelings, and a lot of their mixed feelings orbited around this idea that the design was like a little too cautious in very specific ways that stopped it from taking flight. And so when we started working on the next expansion, I said, look, this like 2 second clip, or this 2 minute clip from this video, let's answer the call to make Root like a little wilder and woollier, because it is a playful thing and will be doing better the more playful it is.
Yeah, yeah. So this ties into a couple aspects. One, I think with expansions, you by default get that freedom more, right? Like
Yes, for sure.
you need the experience to be a little tighter up front, and once you've got your audience in and you know the core of your game, you can take people on journeys, right? I mean, we made some pirate sets of Ascension, as part of year like 8 or something, that was like crazy characters moving around the board and everything, that was just like, it would have been insane if I tried to do that at the beginning, right? Like,
Yeah.
so there's some fun things that open up, um I think, just by default over time. And then two, I think the what expectations you set for your players is so critical when it comes to like the freedom you have as a designer, right? Like, the art style and world building of Root makes people feel like they should be more
Yes.
invested, and you could have more unique characters and a bit more whimsy, wild and woolly, I think is the way you put it. But
Yeah.
and so I've told the story before, but it's with Shards of Infinity. I mentioned I started the game without unique player powers, but I gave you a character that had a backstory and had a very different look. And I didn't until I had the actual production version in my hands. We had a giant character with a health dial in front of you, and the fact that that character was so big and so like prominent in front of you as part of the game made it feel more like this should do something. This needs to be different. And so that's where we did that with the expansion. But it was like the promise of the visual components indicated that this game needed something that was more than it was there
Yeah.
for. But to give us kind of full circle back to this idea of how the visuals and the design influence each other, which has become a great sub theme of this conversation. Um, Okay, I love Root. That's definitely the game of yours I have the most experience with, and so, but we've probably beat it to death. For anybody that's not as familiar with Root, hopefully you still got plenty out of it, because I think asymmetric starting positions, the relationship of art and design, all really play in here. I want to speak a little bit about your Oath game and this idea of legacy gameplay, because it's another very meaty topic. What made you decide a legacy game? Maybe talk a little bit about it and how you chose to build legacy into that game, and we
Sure.
can bounce back and forth on that a little bit.
So Oath has kind of two origin points. The first origin point is watching people play Root and how they talked about Root as if they were telling a generational story. Like, people would say, "Oh yeah, my dad, he won like 3 games in a row, and then suddenly a player dethroned him." And I was thinking, like, well, this meta conversation about the game is not really what the game was doing at all. Like, there was a discussion about the story the game was telling that was fully outside of what the game was doing, and I started wondering, like, is it possible to design a game where my starting point is a conversation that players are having about the game when they're not playing it? And just like designing a game for the meta almost. And then the other origin point of Oath was playing a lot of legacy games and kind of being a little dissatisfied by them. I mean, legacy games are funny in the board game space. These games that players kind of open up, they play them over the course of maybe 5 to 15 games. They tell a pre-written story. It might be nonlinear, and then at the end, the game either has like a special mode that you play, or it's fully bricked because you've told this story. And even the really good legacy games always, to me, struck me like bad television. Like, the best
Hmm.
legacy game is like an okay series of a show, and it's
Hmm.
because they have these pre-sculpted like every trick that the game can do, the designers already know it before you start playing. And
Hmm.
I thought, like, for my own sake, I love when players surprise me with really inventive play. And so I just kept wondering, like, is there another way to approach the legacy framework than offering a big pre-written narrative? And so I had this idea of like, okay, well, what if we built a game, and the core premise of Oath, I mean, I wrote this on a little post-it and like stuck it to my monitor, is like, Oath remembers how you played it. So the very core foundation of Oath is the end state that you create collectively in that game is the start state for the next game. And what this does is it means that if you, depending on how you win, it informs and shapes the next game that is going to be played. So if you win by destroying everything in the world, The next game is like Baron. And if you win by building a big city, the next game is in the city. This is a very weird design challenge because you end up feeling like you're designing a video game engine or like a framework or a role playing system rather than a board game, because board games are like little entropy systems. Like when you play a game of chess, all of your potential energy is housed in those chess pieces, and at the end of a game of chess, there's like 4 pieces on the board. Like there's no juice left. You can't just play another game of chess in that setup. So we had to do certain things that would allow the game to like heal itself and to prepare for that next game. Um, but it was an interesting process, which I'm sure we'll get into. But basically, going into that game, that was basically all I had. I did not know if the game that we were working on was going to be possible. I didn't have a sense of what genre it was going to be. I didn't even have any like central mechanical hook. I just said, this is the high order thing, what I want the game to do. And then the longer I worked on it, we started slowly establishing some of the mechanical foundations for the game that were tied into that premise.
Yeah, yeah, I like that, and I love the idea of playing with legacy and different ways to do that, right? So the it telling some story that lingers. And I personally, yeah, I personally also took like I took issue with the idea of like this game is bricked because I've done everything right.
Yeah.
It bothered me. So we did a legacy game. We did a legacy gameplay with Shards of Infinity. Also, the first version was in Shadows of Salvation, where it was like kind of a choose your own adventure book, basically, that you could go battle through. You'd move through the different aspects of it. Your deck would be permanently, quote unquote, permanently modified till you got to the end of the journey. There was some time travel that could move you back and forth if you lost somewhere in this path. But then you could also just still reset it and play it again, right? So there's enough variety that you would play it more than once. There was enough different experiences there, because I just didn't like the idea of destroying my game. And then
Yeah.
with the latest version of it, we did a new thing called the Saga mode, which is, again, we've called it Legacy Light, where in essence, it's like all of the expansions in one box, and we're using the legacy experience as a way to unlock the expansions as you go, right? So that for a player, because I
Mhm.
don't want to give you all the content up front, but
Right.
it's still falling into the trap, as you put it, or kind of this idea that like it's there's nothing that I haven't thought of that's happening that's in there, but there's enough variety in a game like that to keep every game is going to be different regardless. So
Right.
with Oath, the idea that so the end states are it's just changing kind of starting board position. There's no
Yeah.
permanent
So
adjustments other than that.
right. So it's changing starting board position, and it establishes basically here's what Oath remembers. It remembers what the starting board position is. It remembers what the victory condition was set at the end of the last game. Um, it remembers what was in the deck, which is very important. And that's really it. Which is to say, it doesn't. We're talking real 8-bit memory. It does not
Mm-hmm.
remember that much. However, the deck is very important because in Oath, the deck is essentially it establishes like a set of rules that modify how the game is played. And so, if for instance, the starting board position has, I'll use the example of like the gambling house. The gambling house is a very powerful card that completely changes how the core like money economy of the game works. If it is in the game, if it persists from one game to another, those games are going to be marked by the fact that you're playing basically a different economic game than in a world that has a bunch of farms in it. So the a lot of the memory is like housed at the level of like a single card that is then holding global rules or things that kind of change it. Now, this actually created so this is very, very built into the the kind of core design of Oath. So I had the thought of like, okay, well, I want to tell a game that can store its history. So I have a way of saving a board position. I know I can do that because of how the board is laid out. But I also knew that I wanted there to be richness and a lot of character in the individual worlds. And so I did this through the deck. So Oath's central mechanism is essentially the world of Oath is a deck of cards. The game is almost entirely card driven. The deck has about 54 cards in it. And critically, only 10% of the deck changes from one game to the next. So at the end of one game, 6 cards are coming out, 6 cards are going in. It is up to like what happened in that game is determining how that shift happens. But this is very important because I wanted players to establish relationships with the cards. So you have to see it in more than one game. If I see a card, even if it's a really cool card, but I see it for one game and then it's out the next game, I don't have time to build any relationship with that card as a player.
Right. Yeah. No, that emotional resonance is gonna build up over time, and as you said, sort of tell the story, emphasize storytelling, which I think is what I'm hearing is kind of the key of what of this execution, right? That I'm going to be able to
Yeah,
have this story between games, like, oh man, you used the gambling house in the last game and the last two
right.
games to win, and now I'm going to get it out of here so that you can't do that next, or you create these kind of meta narratives for people who play a game over multiple sessions.
And it's worth drilling into the detail of card flow because it established all of these weird rules. So I said, okay, well the deck is 54 cards. So if there's a card in the game, there has to be a chance that you don't know precisely which cards were kicked out of the game, which means not all the cards are have to be played with from one game to the next. And I use the example of like a lost sword in a fantasy novel. The thing about a lost sword or a lost artifact story is that people thought it was gone forever, but actually it's still here. Like the ring was just at the bottom of the river. And so, in order to create that in a game, you have to not use all of the cards each game. And so I was like, well, arbitrarily, let's say I use half the cards in each game. So I have a deck of 54 cards. We shuffle it up. We play with the top half of that deck. At the end of the game, we're going to shuffle the deck again. We're going to play with the top half. Well, over several games, the ring could seem quite lost, and then it pops up in game 4. But then when I got around to the problem of actually designing the game, I ran into this issue where I needed to make a game that worked with a deck of 24 cards or 22 cards, or 20, I
Hmm.
guess 27. But like all of these things have these very funny follow-on effects where when it came time to actually build the mechanisms of the game, I didn't go to a blank page. I went to a I know that the design needs this many cards. The full game, the full storytelling power of the game has to be able to be executed with pretty few components because the game has to change. I mean, Oath is a funny design because there's a lot of content in that box and players are playing with, 20% of it or 10% of it in any particular game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's one. I'm just sort of noticing a trend that you like to take very hard game design projects on, where you're taking on a
It's a
lot
real
more
problem.
design than most players will actually encounter, which is fun. But this idea, which I do think is important to kind of emphasize, that like, look, when you're creating your initial design hook, and then you start to create some design constraints that come out of the kind of emotional impact or story impact that you want to have, and then those ripple down because games are very sensitive systems, right? They're going to really, one little tweak over here is going to have ripple effects down to the other side of it. And so knowing what the core is of like, no, 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 this is the experience that I want, this is the experience
Yeah.
that matters, and thus as you play with it, you'll start to realize, okay, that means this has to happen, this has to happen, and this has to happen. Now, okay, within that constraint, what can I build and how do I move to where I want people to go, right? So I hear that logic with you, which is I think is exactly the way I think about games, and it's worth like just kind of making a little explicit because I think a lot of people will benefit from understanding that better.
Well, and I want to underline too the degree to which these difficult projects are made possible because of how our company is structured. So I am the creative director here at Leader Games. We run crowdfunding projects, and our audience loves really ambitious, strange, kind of almost avant-garde designs. It's sort of where our core audience is, and our whole model is built not on making a game that's going to sell a million copies, but kind of keeping that 60,000 people core audience as happy as they can be. And so I usually tell people, like when I'm looking at a potential title for Leader Games, I kind of ask myself two questions. Like, first of all, is this project like much too difficult for a small studio to take on because it's too big? And then also, on the other hand, is it much too risky for a large studio? And if it's in that sweet zone where it's like too hard for a small studio, but too dumb and risky for a large studio, it's
Hmm.
probably a good fit for what we do.
Fascinating. I love that way of looking at your business model. I think these things are how big is your studio? Just since we're
We
talking
have
about a medium.
17 full-time people.
Awesome. Okay. And how
So
many of
we're
those work on the kind of game design portion specifically?
half, about
Okay.
half. Yeah. And so,
Great. Yeah.
and we when we work on projects, it is usually like an all hands on deck or at least full team on deck. And I want to have Kyle, our artist and our graphic designer, in the very first meeting about a game. In fact, I mean, some of
And
my favorite Oath art was done before Oath had a name, any components, where Kyle was just kind of vibing with the general project and what it might be. We didn't really know what we were going to be building together yet at that point.
And how often are you releasing games?
Once a year on average,
Okay.
maybe once every 16 months.
Yeah.
Something like Arcs took like 2.5 years to build. So it's a pretty slow schedule.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Just to give people a sense of how much work these things take. That's a lot of resources devoted to these projects. So it is a pretty risky gamble in the scheme of things for how many resources have to get added into one of these projects succeeding. Like if
Yeah.
a project doesn't succeed in that, you're talking about maybe 3 years of
Yeah.
cost per one
Yeah.
output.
I mean, we measure the success of our studio in how many projects we feel comfortable canceling.
Mm,
And I mean, it's funny. Sometimes I will be hanging out with other publishers, and they'll be like, "Oh, like, what are your benchmarks this year? How many games are you trying to make?" And I usually tell them, like, "Look, man, I'm trying to make fewer games more slowly
yeah.
because I do think something special happens when you work on a game for 6 months and then throw it away and then start again. That you just can't. There's no way to replicate that. And it's a thing. It's a thing that amateurs and non-professional designers are able to do, but professional designers are very rarely able to do it. Because the opportunity cost for you're like I'm a software engineer. I don't necessarily need this game, so I'm going to take my game and I'm going to throw it away. I'm going to restart it, and it's on that second or third restart that something really starts to take off. And so we really try to preserve that flexibility at the studio.
Yeah, no, and I will have games that will s- be shelved and then come back years later, and then get shelved again, and then come back
Yeah,
years later, and then finally there's a home for it. And some of those are still in my back catalog, so
right.
it's a never ending process. But um, uh, I think that let's use we're running low on time, so let's kind of future predict here a
Sure,
little bit, right? You've found a great niche here that lets you work on some really compelling long tail games that take lots of effort and have an audience that you've delivered to. um, Crowdfunding as a business model, you wouldn't be able to exist and do this kind of thing without that.
sure.
And so, as the future of games and the industry is shifting, what do you see changing now, 2 years, 5 years down the road? How do you think about what the future of design might look like or publishing might look like?
In the space of hobby games, I think there was really a pretty magical period of about 15 years where it felt like everybody who was playing hobby games was kind of in one place. And you could see this when you would look at something like the BGG Top 100 games, where there was a real coherence to that list. Like it was as if one group had got together and decided these are the top 100 games that we care about. And we are now no longer in that mode. There are so many sub communities who have found really, I mean, there are so many amazing audiences who have really built communities around specific titles. And the reason I mentioned BGG is you can now see this in the top 100 list, where when you look at that top 100 list as a single list, it is not coherent. It doesn't make any sense why Gloomhaven is next to Terraforming Mars, except it's telling you, boy, there are a lot of people who care about Gloomhaven. There are a lot of people who care about Terraforming Mars. They're not the same person usually. And so I think one thing that we have seen at Leader is the movement to game-based discussion forums. I mean, it's almost like the 90s or something, where our company discords where people are talking about Root are tremendously exciting spaces, where you get a lot of like audience activation. It gives us a lot of stability in our business models, but it also starts to stop games from really hitting a wider audience. And so to me, there's this funny, I think that we're at a really interesting point of fragmentation where the types of games that I work on, we are on the one hand drilling incredibly deep it's like it's never been easier to like have an evergreen that works for a specific audience, but on the other hand, it's never been harder to figure out which games you want to try to make the general like mass market appeal to. And this is reflected in our own production schedule. So right now we're working on two projects. I'm finishing a big expansion to Oath, which sort of changes its 8-bit memory to a 16-bit memory, and allows the game to remember a lot more and change a lot more. And then we're working on a Root expansion. I don't expect either one of those expansions to actually grow the audience at all. Those are these are games that are built to make our existing audience happy, to show our commitment to keeping these games alive. But we are not currently working on a like a big hit, and it's because something that I have found as just a company head is it is a lot of work to maintain a living game. I'm sure you had this with Ascension. It's like the biggest thing I did not understand about Root. I thought I was going to finish Root and be done forever. And
Mm-hmm.
instead, I was at a Root meeting earlier this morning, and we're we're 7 years from Root's release, um,
Yeah.
and the degree to which it actually takes time to service those communities and keep those games alive. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you see more game companies basically become, these are almost single title shops that are just there to support those communities and keep them alive.
Yeah, so this is the 15-year anniversary of Ascension. At Gen Con will be the exact moment of our first sale. And yeah, we're at 17 fully standalone expansions and a bunch more promo packs and side quests and who knows what's. And that's I often wonder because I definitely spent a lot of energy on a bunch of other games. If I had actually just doubled down and really focused on that where the business would be. And it's an interesting model because it's such a hit driven business.
Yes.
And you're right, the costs of maintaining and expanding and keeping and it's not it's hit driven and it's recency driven, right? If a
Yes.
game could be it used to be like, look, this is just a great game and you buy it and you could continue to buy it and that's great, but that just doesn't work like that anymore. Like it's if a game is great, it has to have expansions or it's quote dead, right?
Yeah.
So which is a really weird phenomenon in game psyche.
Yeah.
And there's very few games that have been released in the last 20 years that succeed but don't have new content coming out.
Well, it's a funny, I mean, it's a little bit like in the digital game space, like the paradox model, which is some of these games, if you want to build them to their fullest extent, they are like 10 or 15-year projects.
Mm,
And so in order to do that, you have to like build these product lines that can actually support it. On the other hand, like that's ridiculous for the vast majority of games. And
yeah.
it is especially, I mean, I feel I'm in a space where I feel like very hopeful about the industry,
Mm,
with an important qualification. I think light games, I think very competitive games, I think heavy-weighted games, historical games are all doing great right now. They have found their audiences. People are doing fantastic design work, but the middle is getting totally hollowed out. Like
mm.
in the context of board games, like that 90-minute, like really interesting Euro design that was going to win the Spiel in like 1998. There is no place for it in the contemporary market, and that's a bummer because those are amazing. There's amazing design work that happens there.
Yeah. There's definitely interesting space there. And I think there's something to be said for like kind of almost how you started in your industry when making these kinds of games and being able to make games that have an audience of 500 or 1,000 and be able to test and build in that space. And I think there will be a time that comes around for, if that 90-minute Euro game is at a lull now, serving a small version of that audience until something can kind of hit and growing it again. I would be surprised if it didn't rise up in some
Right.
form or another. We'll wrap up. I want to say, one, is there any advice that you'd have given this kind of context of design and publishing now for someone that wants to kind of break in or is thinking about
Sure.
designing or pitching to a publisher or to moving things? What advice would you have kind of beyond the stuff we've already talked about here to that audience member?
No one is going to be as critical, as skeptical, as hard on yourself as you will be. So when you're working on your game, like preserve your own skepticism about your work. Like really ask. I mean, I always tell people that, I mean, making games is almost, I mean, I think about it as almost like something sacred. It's so rare. It's so precious. If you're going to build something, really do care about it and try to make something that you hold to a really high standard. Sometimes when we work on games, it becomes more tempting to finish a game than to make it good. Don't ever fall in that trap because it's never going to lead you to where you want to be.
Great advice. And where, if people want to find your stuff, find your games, follow you, where would you direct them?
For the leader game stuff, the best place is the website, leadergames.com. For the historical games, you can find me at wehrlegig.com. That's WEHRLEGIG.com. These days, my social media is kind of fully moved over to Blue Sky. So if you just search Cole Wehrle on Blue Sky, you'll find me there.
Awesome. Cole, thanks so much, man. This was great. I love this kind of deep dive. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for taking the time.
There is so much more to talk about, Justin. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to do a part 2 because I could have gone a lot further, but I will have to wait for next time.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, man.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. If you want to support the podcast, please rate, comment, and share on your favorite podcast platforms, such as iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever device you're listening on. Listener reviews and shares make a huge difference and help us grow this community and will allow me to bring more amazing guests and insights to you. I've taken the insights from these interviews along with my 20 years of experience in the game industry and compressed it all into a book with the same title as this podcast, Think Like a Game Designer. In it, I give step-by-step instructions on how to apply the lessons from these great designers and bring your own games to life. If you think you might be interested, you can check out the book at thinklikeagamedesigner.com or wherever fine books are sold.